Today is Wednesday, April 24th, and we are starting the last chapter of the AP textbook. Finally, Chapter 23, Capitalism and Culture. So just a quick reminder, on Friday, you guys should be able to turn in your Chapter 22 worksheet and your Chapter 22 quiz, which was the take-home SAQ that we talked about yesterday in class. So make sure that you guys turn that in no later than Friday. So just come by sometime throughout the day and drop that off. And we're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 23. All right, we'll start with this picture. This is a NASA photograph. Of course, it's showing both the Earth and the Moon. And just from looking at this type of an image, we don't really get an idea of the things that tend to divide humankind, to divide societies and groups from one another, like national differences or ethnic and religious differences or different languages. And so pictures like this can sometimes help create a new consciousness of a global community instead of a regional one, and can sometimes help us realize that we have a lot more in common than we do differences. All right, guys, if you can pause the video here for a moment and read this paragraph that is on the left side of this slide. So go ahead and push pause. All right, hopefully you just read the paragraph. This story was about Mimi. She was a young, uneducated woman from Java in Indonesia, and she's an example of someone like millions of other women who are victimized by these international networks of sex trafficking. And this involves political relationships, economic transactions, cultural influences, and of course the movement of people across international borders. And throughout this chapter, when we talk about globalization, we'll see some positive effects of it. We'll also see some negative effects, such as sex trafficking. But globalization just means accelerating engagement among distant peoples. So it's not necessarily a positive and it's not necessarily a negative. It just depends on the specific type of globalization, the specific consequences of globalization that you're focusing on at that time. So globalization picks up its pace and deepens its impact after World War II. And we are moving on to the next slide. All right. So I know period 6 is a pretty intense and varied period in our AP World History textbook. So think way back to the beginning. We've been on period 6 for a while, but in chapter 20, we talked about World War I and the Great Depression. And we know that production picks up during periods of war, but after World War I was over, we saw that the production dropped off. And because of a lot of factors, we have this Great Depression period. So it's going to wreak havoc on the world economy. And a lot of that has to do with the stock market crash in the United States. And remember that after World War I, the United States was serving as the bank for the rest of the world. And so they were providing money so that Germany could repay, make those reparation payments to Britain and France so that they could then repay the United States. So if the U.S. is having a tough time economically, it trickles around the world. After World War II, we see a different situation develop. The capitalist nations, led by one of our superpowers, the United States, met at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, and they forged this set of agreements and institutions. That's when we saw the World Bank form and the International Monetary Fund. And this just negotiated the rules for commercial and financial dealings among these major capitalist nations, with the goal of promoting free trade and stable currency values. And in this instance, it would be linked to the US dollar. So after World War II, we saw a devastated Europe, and the dollar replaces the pound as the most dependable global currency. Technology is going to contribute to this acceleration of economic globalization. We see lowered transportation costs due to technology like containerized shipping, huge oil tankers, and air express services. And we see communication infrastructure become more globalized with fiber optic cables and the internet. So liberalism is nothing new in history at this time. Liberalism just means the emphasis on individual autonomy, creating more equal opportunities for people, and protecting individual rights. And we've been talking about that for quite some time in AP World, especially going back to our revolutions chapter. But when we talk about neoliberalism, this is when it is focused more on economics. So not society as a whole, it's zeroed in on the economy. And we see capitalist countries abandoning a lot of those earlier political controls and viewing the world instead as a single market, a global market. So we see favoring the reduction of tariffs, global movement of capital. Many state-run enterprises become privatized, and government regulation of the economy is lessened, and we see tax and spending cuts. So as communism collapsed by the end of the 20th century, capitalism was global and the globe was capitalist. As far as goods, after World War II, there was an accelerating circulation of goods, capital, and people. World trade in 1947 was $57 billion. By 2012, it involved $18.3 trillion. And we start to see these companies have a hold in multiple countries. So Twinings of London, that's a tea company, they marketed 120 different blends of tea from over 100 countries. A shoe polish that's from Australia was sold in 180 countries. Walmart in 2005, we see 70% of the products included Chinese components. And Toyota, a Japanese company, replaced General Motors, an American company, in 2006 as the world's largest automaker. So we can see that globalization in play here as far as where the goods were available, where the goods came from. So we also see an increase in something called foreign direct investment. This is when a firm in a nation, such as the United States, for instance, opens a factory in China or Mexico. And this trend is going to explode after 1960. And there were lots of benefits to the corporations. Cheaper labor, tax breaks, looser environmental regulations in developing countries. However, we do see increasing reaction against this idea of the United States opening a factory somewhere else. More focus on the quality of life for the people, the labor in those factories overseas, for instance, or the impact of footprint on the environment. We see some short-term movement of capital where investors spent trillions purchasing foreign currencies or stocks likely to increase in value and then selling them very quickly. And we see international credit cards develop. In 2013, MasterCard was accepted at 33 million businesses in 220 countries or territories. So of course, this helps. If you have a MasterCard, you can purchase things almost anywhere you go. This image shows the foreign investments in millions of dollars. So the larger the red circle, the larger the foreign investments. And this is as of 1998 in this image here. And so we have regions who are clearly receiving the most investment from abroad and other regions which are receiving the least. And we can't really make a strong global north, global south conclusion based on this data that we see on the screen. But we do see some areas that have less investment. So if you look at Africa, for instance, or the Middle East, then those dots are fewer or much, much smaller. And some of these regions are acceptors of investment as well as recipients of it, like the United States and Western Europe and Japan. Okay, the next topic is transnational corporations. And that is the first Barbie on the screen there. And we're going to talk about Barbie from the Mattel Corporation as an example of a TNC, or a transnational corporation. These are just really huge global businesses, and they produce goods or deliver services simultaneously in a lot of countries. And if we look at Barbie from Mattel, we can see how global this process of producing and selling these dolls really is. So they are made in factories in Indonesia, Malaysia, and China. The molds to create them were from the United States. The plastic used for her body and her hair is from Taiwan and Japan. The cotton cloth for the clothing is from China. There are distribution centers in Hong Kong, and more than 1 billion Barbies were sold in 150 countries by 1999. So if you're trying to think of a good example of a transnational corporation, and it happens to be one of those SAQs on the AP exam, Barbie from Mattel is an excellent example to give. Other examples, Royal Dutch Shell, which is a British and Dutch oil company, Sony, or General Motors. By 2001, 51 of the world's 100 largest economic units weren't countries, they were TNCs. And so we see firms moving their facilities sometimes quickly from place to place to try to lower their costs or to reduce the environmental regulations, especially if a location where they have a factory is regulating the environmental footprint of these companies more. Well, the corporation may see it in their best interest to just pick up that factory and move it somewhere else to a new location that has fewer regulations. Nike, for instance, in 5 years closed 20 factories and opened 35 others, often thousands of miles apart. So we can see that at play with Nike. This image shows, this is a call center in northeastern India, and it shows this voice training that happens so that people who work at these Indian-based call centers that serve North American or European companies and customers can communicate more effectively with their English-speaking callers that answer the phone, and hopefully have more success with those customers. We see new patterns of human migration driven by war, revolution, poverty, and the end of empire. And we've talked about most of these before, so this should be a little bit of a review for you. We know that the Ottoman Empire collapsed following World War I, and as we see the Republic of Turkey form, there is a migration of people that happens. So 1 million Greek Orthodox Christians migrate from Turkey and relocate to Greece, while 400,000 Turkish-speaking Muslims living in Greece move in the other direction, to Turkey. Jews who are fleeing anti-Semitism, fascism, and the Holocaust immigrated to Israel in large numbers, and that generated a flow of Palestinian refugees to neighboring countries. And hopefully you guys did your Arab-Israeli conflict reading, and if so, you should know a lot about that. Political repression and forced labor in the Soviet Union pushed millions into camps of the Gulag, primarily in Siberia. So any kind of political opponents or prisoners of war would end up in these gulags. As South Africa industrialized and under especially their apartheid policies, this drew millions of male workers from the countryside into mines and factories under terrible conditions. And we see 1 million Chinese have migrated to Africa, where Chinese trade and investment have increased. And there's been a vast movement of people from developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America to North America and Europe. Sometimes illegally and with few skills, but they have this hope and belief in a better future for themselves and their families. Some examples of this: Pakistanis, Indians, and West Indians moving to Great Britain, Algerians and West Africans to France, Turks and Kurds to Germany, and Filipinos, Koreans, Cubans, Mexicans, and Haitians to the United States. By 2003, 4 million Filipino domestic workers were employed in 130 countries. And hearkening back to one of those first images from this PowerPoint, we can't forget that there is a whole other industry involved in globalization, and that is sex trafficking. So young women by the hundreds of thousands were recruited, sometimes without their knowledge, as sex workers in wealthier nations, and they would be left in slavery-like conditions. Sometimes highly skilled and university-trained people, such as doctors or computer scientists, were not able to find professional opportunities or jobs in their own countries, and so that drives them to migrate to another country where they can use their skills that they've worked hard to attain. And other people moved as refugees, fleeing violence or political oppression. Vietnam, Cambodia, Sudan, Uganda, Cuba, and Haiti are examples of people who migrate to escape violence. From 1971 to 2010, 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States legally, and then we saw millions more illegally, mostly from Latin American, Caribbean nations or from Asia. The largest group making their way to the United States are Mexicans, many illegally, and this process, this illegal move, involves walking across burning hot deserts, evading American immigration authorities, depending on expensive and unreliable coyotes who they would pay large sums of money to help them get across the border. And those that made it to the United States would provide inexpensive labor in fields, factories, or in homes of wealthy Americans. Often, much of that money would be sent back to families still in Mexico. And as we know, living in the United States, this presence of migrants from the global south creates a lot of cultural and political conflict, not just here, but also in Europe as well, of just this constant dialogue of how do we deal with immigration, both legally and illegally. Now we're going to move to a controversy in France that involves this movement of people. And in France, there are about 5 million Muslims living there. And there is a controversy that I want to start by playing the video, and then we can talk about it just a little bit. So we're going to pause here, and I'll pull up the video.
So women are now officially banned from wearing full-face veils in public after controversial law came into effect. While the government says the move is aimed at helping Muslims adapt to the local community, critics accuse President Sarkozy of persecuting Islam to win back votes from the right. But in a country with Europe's biggest Muslim population, the law risks igniting social tensions, as Daniel Bushell reports.
Hymns just become a criminal. From today, a new French law bans covering your face in public. It's designed to make Muslim women integrate in society. But the softly spoken single mom says it's had the opposite effect.
My friends have simply stopped going out at all.
The new rulings made some scared to speak out, but many vow not to change the way they dress. The move undermines what the French Republic stands for, says this businessman. He pledges to pay the €150 fine for anyone who continues to wear a veil and is taking the dispute further.
We are suing France in the European Court of Human Rights. It's about freedom of expression.
Abderrahmane Dahman was fired as Nicolas Sarkozy's integration advisor last month after criticising the president's approach. He now calls on French Muslims to wear a star similar to the one forced on Jews by the Nazis.
This government should learn how to negotiate.
Opinion polls show record low approval ratings for the French government, with accusations it's deliberately stirring interracial tension.
Friday prayers in Paris, Muslims are forced to worship on the street. The government blocks the building of basic public prayer rooms. More discrimination, say worshippers, against the Muslim population.
France has seen riots in recent years against government policies. There are signs of more brewing.
It is a distinct possibility, especially when the domestic decisions and events and foreign decisions and events come together.
Those foreign events have also outraged partners in Europe. Jennings blames France's illegal deportation of Roma and sending North African refugees back to Italy in the face of international anger. That splits the Franco-German axis that drives the EU.
This axis, as it has been called sometimes, is not functioning.
Analysts fear France can no longer lecture Muslim regimes when it picks on its own ethnic minorities.
Why should we stop prosecuting Christians if you are prosecuting Muslims? Saying you have absolutely no credibility or reliability to tell us what we should do.
But cracks are forming within the French government over its hardline policies. Several high-profile politicians in the ruling UMP party last week quit. More are expected to do the same in the coming days. Daniel Bushell, RT, Paris.
So data from 2015 showed that 1,546 of these fines had been imposed under the law. And again, these fines, 150 euros, which amounts to $217 or so. And there was a case in 2014 where a 24-year-old French woman argued that the ban violated her freedom of religion and her freedom of expression. And so we absolutely see that there's an argument concerning human rights and individualism that comes into play with this case. Most of the population agree with the government when it describes the face covering veil as an affront to society's values, which I think is interesting because most Muslims actually agreed with that statement as well. However, we still have critics. Most of these critics are outside of France, and they say it's a violation of individual liberties. And a ban on Muslim headscarves and other conspicuous religious symbols at state schools was introduced in 2004, and it's received overwhelming political and public support in France. And brings people from diverse cultures together. We'll continue to see sometimes a culture clash, as evidenced in the headscarf controversy in France. As we mentioned before, globalization is not a negative or a positive term. It can have positive or negative effects. Some of the positives: world output overall has grown. In 1950, we see $7 trillion. By 2009, that amount was up to 73 trillion. Life expectancies expanded almost everywhere. Infant mortality rate declined, and literacy grew. However, we do see some negatives. Soaring oil prices contributed to a stock market crash in 1973 and 74, and that led to a lot of hardship for many developing countries. Inability to pay mounting debts led to a financial crisis in Latin America in the 80s, and this is a lost decade of economic development. And financial crisis in Asia during the late 1990s led to the collapse of a lot of businesses, widespread unemployment, and political upheaval in Indonesia and Thailand. Here in the United States, in 2008, we had an inflated housing market, or a bubble, that collapsed, and that triggered millions of home foreclosures, growing unemployment, tightening of credit, and declining consumer spending. And this crisis rippled across the world. So similar to what we saw in our Great Depression period, when the United States is experiencing an economic crisis, it does have a ripple effect. In Iceland, their economy collapsed almost overnight. 3 major banks failed, the stock market dropped by 80%, and the currency lost more than 70% of its value in just 1 week. In Africa, there was reduced demand for exports. In Sierra Leone specifically, 90% of the country's diamond mine workers lost their jobs. In China, the slowing of the economy led to an unemployment rate of 1 in 7, and many were forced to return to overcrowded rural areas. Central American and Caribbean families did not receive as much money from family working abroad. And we also saw debt crisis in Greece, Italy, and Spain. So here, just like we talked about after the Great Depression, we see some people pointing out the flaws in capitalism. So what happened to that economic stability and that progress? Is equality not something attainable? There is a division between the rich industrialized countries and everyone else. We've talked at great length about the global south and the global north. I think the next statistic is pretty telling. The ratio between the income of the top and bottom 20% of the world's population has drastically not changed, but has drastically intensified. In 1891, the difference in income between the top and bottom 20% was 3 to 1. 1991, just 100 years later, 86 to 1 difference between the richest and the poorest. George Soros is a well-known capitalist, financier, and investor, and he's a billionaire many, many times over. And he said the global capitalist system has produced a very uneven playing field. The gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider. And as we see on the screen, there are different ways to view George Soros. On the left, we see billionaire Soros to invest $500 million to help migrants and refugees. And that's a very positive look on his investment. However, on the other article, and many people feel this way, George Soros behind plan to flood the EU with cheap migrant labor, claims Hungary government. And remember, whenever we talked about Brexit, one of the reasons that people were dissatisfied and wanted to exit the EU was they felt that there were too many migrants coming in to Britain from other places. And so Soros is one of those figures where he has people who support his investment going to help migrants, and those that oppose it, saying that it's hurting the native people in that nation. So as we see the East and West division of capitalism and communism fade, we see that global North and global South gaining prominence instead. And if we look at this data on the screen, that's a lot of data, I know. But in our conversation today, we're going to focus on two columns, the low income and the upper income. So this column right here and this one. I mean, take a look at this later at your convenience, but we're going to focus on talking about these two ends of the spectrum. So on the left, we see some different categories, and then we see some numbers, some data to back up some statistics. So first of all, with life expectancy, we see the male and the female in years. In the low income areas, the life expectancy for males is 58, whereas upper income, it's 77. For females, 60 in the low income areas versus 83 in the upper income. As far as deaths under age 5, per 1,000 live births, we see in the low income region 120 deaths versus only 7 in upper income. Deaths from infectious disease as a percent, 36% to just 7. Access to toilet percentages in low income, only 35% of people have access to a toilet. In the upper income, which of course includes USA, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, 99% of people have access to a toilet. We see differences in years of education, 7.9 versus 14.5. Literacy rate is 66% versus 99%. This is where it switches a little. Population growth, percent of annual. Remember that we see the global south gaining, continuously gaining. as far as total world population. So we have a 2.27% annual population growth in the low-income regions, that global south, versus the 0.39 in the upper. As far as urban population, only 27% versus 78%. Cell phones per 100 people. In low-income regions, only 22 cell phones per 100 people versus, interestingly enough, 106 cell phones per 100 people. And I'm guessing this is for people who have a business phone and then a personal phone. So I'm just guessing where that other 6 phones comes from there. Internet users per 100 people, 2.3 out of 100 in low income, 68.3 in upper. As far as personal computers, 1.2 out of 100 people, 60.4 in upper income. Cars per 1,000. This is a pretty big difference. Remember, cars offer mobility, it offers freedom, it offers the ability to travel for work and to make a living. Cars per 1,000 people in low-income regions, only 5.8 cars versus 435.1 cars in our upper income bracket. Now here, the negative of the upper income. Carbon dioxide emissions are only 1 metric ton per capita for low income. In the upper, it's 13. So we can see that environmental impact of globalization, of industrialization, is higher in that upper income category. So in the 1970s, we see a large group of developing countries join together, and they're trying to demand a new international economic order, one that's more fair to improving their standard of living in developing countries in the global south. There's going to be active resistance by rich nations. They want to protect their own interests. In other words, things are looking pretty good for them right now. They're not terribly interested in changing things. The second reason, they have little in common with each other. In the Middle East, they're oil producing. Central America, bananas. We have industrial states of China, India, and South Korea, and also impoverished African countries. So there's a lot of differences in these global south nations. It's not like they're uniform. They're not all alike. They're very different. So as far as these inequalities among individual rich and poor nations, we see United States manufacturing jobs moving offshore to Asia or Latin America. This leaves our relatively unskilled Americans with only jobs in the low-wage service sector. On the other hand, we have some Americans gaining very wealthy or gaining a lot of wealth in these high-tech industries that are emerging. Even some of that high-skilled work, though, is being outsourced to lower-wage sites in India, Ireland, Russia, and elsewhere. So this, by some, is considered an erosion of the American middle class. If those jobs are disappearing and there are only low-wage jobs available or high-wage, high-skilled tech jobs, then what happens to everyone in the middle in America? And that's why we see a lot of I'm trying to find the right word, a lot of differing opinions, a lot of kickback from groups who say that jobs should stay home here in America versus being outsourced overseas. In Mexico specifically, we have businesses and manufacturing groups that have ties to the United States in the north, and so they're going to be more prosperous. In the south, they're more rural and agricultural, and their growth is far slower than in the north because of that distance from having a link with the United States. So we see a rebellion in 1994 among the southern agricultural areas, and this was led by the gentleman on the screen, Subcomandante Marcos, and he ran his rebellion on a strongly anti-globalization platform. He felt that globalization was a, quote, process to eliminate that multitude of people who are not useful to the powerful, end quote. So he was speaking up for the rural population in the southern region of Mexico And I think that photograph is pretty fantastic. If you want to follow a rule book for how to create a portrait that tries to make you look as tough as possible, I think having one where you're on a horse and you got weapons and you got a face mask and you're somehow still smoking a pipe through the face mask, it's probably the epitome of that attempt. Third, in China, by 2000, the city income was 3 times that of the countryside. So again, we see this urban bias where there's more investment and more higher standard of living for people who live in these industrialized urban areas versus the countryside. And it does lead to rebellions like the one led by Marcos in Mexico. So we start to see anti-globalization become a growing movement in the 1990s. It's very diverse. There's a global scope to it. And there was generally an agreement that free trade and market-driven corporate globalization did all of the following: lowered labor standards, fostered ecological degradation, so we see, in other words, the environment suffering, prevented poor countries from protecting themselves. They didn't have really leverage to speak for themselves effectively, ignoring local cultures, disregarding human rights, enhancing global inequality, so increasing that divide between the global north and the global south, increasing that divide between the top 20% and the bottom 20% of a nation, and favoring those large corporations and rich countries. In 1999, there was a meeting of World Trade Organization in Seattle. There were 149 nations represented, and they were charged with negotiating rules for global commerce and free trade. And there were tens of thousands of protesters at this meeting, and they were arguing instead for fair trade. And we can see some of their complaints on their banners and their signs. Defend our forests, clear cut the WTO. WTO hurts forests, stop exploiting workers. And so they're speaking out against the World Trade Organization instead in favor of fair trade. And in 2001, there was a World Social Forum where they were imagining that another world is possible beyond this market-driven corporate globalization that we have today. Moving quickly through chapter 23, but we've got to get to our review for our AP exam, so we're going to move on along. We see a lot of people expressing resistance to an American empire as this face of globalization. There's some debate. A lot of Americans deny that empire label, but it could be considered an empire of production. So a dominant power using economic and political pressure, sometimes military action, to create societies and governments that will be compatible with United States values and interests. This doesn't involve necessarily directly governing those societies, those large populations for long periods of time, but it is an attempt to create governments that are compatible with United States interests. There's also talk of soft power. This is the attractiveness of U.S. culture and in the fact that there are political, cultural, and economic freedoms. So often there's a willingness to follow the American lead voluntarily because of those perceived freedoms. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War led to unchecked U.S. military dominance. And we all know 9/11 of 2001, the United States was attacked by Islamic militants, and this led to the United States military being unleashed on, first of all, Afghanistan in 2001. They had sheltered Al-Qaeda instigators of that attack on 9/11. And again, Al-Qaeda is a militant Sunni Islamic multinational organization, terrorist organization, founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden. U.S. military was also unleashed on Iraq in 2003, where Saddam Hussein allegedly had been developing weapons of mass destruction. Afghan and Iraqi regimes were quickly defeated, but this U.S. struggle to contain or eliminate Islamic terrorism continues. Here we see the two faces of an American empire. So I think this is an interesting juxtaposition of maps because it shows on the top we've got politics and military. On the bottom we have culture, economics, consumerism, and we can see if we overlay them, it lines up not 100% the same, but pretty similar. So the top map shows the United States bases and interventions abroad. So the green areas are countries that housed U.S. military bases in the early 21st century, and the red dots are the U.S. military or CIA interventions since 1950. The bottom map shows the locations of McDonald's restaurants. The larger the circle, the more McDonald's that nation has. And we can see here Japan has quite a few. Europe has a lot, some nations in Europe having more than others. Canada has a pretty large circle as well, but none of the circles are as large as the United States circle. And this data was from 2003, and we know that there were more than 10,000 in America in 2003. But as of 2016 or 2017 or so, there were over 14,000 McDonald's in the United States. But again, if you look at both of these maps together, we see that where the United States military goes, McDonald's tends to follow. The United States experienced growing competition when it came to the international economy. Europe and Japan's recovery after World War II is a factor, and the industrialization of South Korea, Taiwan, China, and India. And we can see that competition in the numbers, in the percentages of the United States' share of overall world production of world merchandise exports. So total exports, United States exports in 1945 was 50%. That's a lot. By the 1980s, it's down to 20% of the world total. 2008, 8.1%. So we can see that the market is more competitive. In 2014, China overtook the United States as the world's largest economy, and they held much of the American national debt. And speaking of American national debt, to whom does the United States government owe money? We can see that a lot of the categories, most of the debt, is to United States individuals and institutions, Federal Reserve, the Military Retirement Fund, so on and so forth. We have 14.7% for all other foreign nations, but the biggest nations that hold our debt are Japan, Belgium and Ireland, Brazil, the United Kingdom, and most of all, China. And so if we look at some more recent data, this is from, the one on the screen is from 2016, but as of February of 2019, the U.S. debt to China is $1.13 trillion. China has the greatest amount of U.S. debt held by a foreign country. Japan comes second at 1.07 trillion, followed by Brazil at 308 billion. Ireland holds 274 billion, and the United Kingdom owns 284 billion. So combined, those top 5 countries hold almost 77% of the United States debt held by foreign countries. And if we look at the percentage of world debt in this image here on the screen, you can see how much of it is held by the United States. Other nations that hold a significant amount include Japan, China, Italy, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. So going back to this exercise of American power, it's often resisted abroad, and it's often contested or argued about at home. Vietnam War, whether America should have been there or not, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, whether there was enough justification for that. In 2014, we see Russia strongly expressing opposition to the West's attempts to incorporate those former Soviet territories in Eastern Europe into NATO or the European Union. Russia seized Crimea and pressured the Ukraine to remain within that Russian sphere of influence. Many intellectuals feared that their own culture would fade away, have spoken out against American cultural imperialism. So this attempt to force American culture, whatever that is, upon the rest of the world. I guess McDonald's would be a face of that American culture, if we refer back to our map earlier. So the United States international policies generated widespread opposition. First of all, the refusal to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And the U.S. government has consistently opposed an international court. And again, this could hold U.S. military and political leaders to a uniform global standard of justice. So the fact that the United States refuses to accept that gains a lot of criticism. Refusal to ratify the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. This is an effort to combat global warming. It includes 191 states, so the refusal to ratify that gains a lot of criticism as well, in addition to the preemptive war in Iraq and the apparent use of torture by U.S. military. And I think we are going to stop there for today, and we'll start class tomorrow by talking about Che Guevara.